This took place sometime around the end of 2004. I was home alone with nothing to do. Our school was closed for a teacher's in-service. I was 14, so my parents didn't mind leaving me alone. That morning, I'd slept till about 9 and had breakfast, something I rarely did. I did what little homework I had and watched TV until 2 p.m. Tired of soap operas, I began walking the house. My mom called to check on me at about 2:15, and we spoke for around 10 minutes. After that, I returned to my search. I briefly considered raiding my folks' liquor cabinet, but getting drunk alone didn't sound very fun. As I rambled around the second floor, the door to the attic caught my attention. I'd been up there once or twice, but never paid much attention. Our house was one of those big Victorian-age farmhouses, the kind with a full-size attic. Before I was born, my grandmother had used it as her sewing room, but now it was just used for storage. My curiosity began getting the best of me, so I flipped on the light and climbed the stairs to the top. The room had a musty smell and was creepily dark, even with the overhead light and sun coming through the lace curtains. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. I walked over to my grand's sewing desk and flipped through some of the papers sitting on it. Nothing interesting, just some tax records from the early 80s. I moved across the room and noticed a big wooden chest. It appeared to be very old. I was hoping some of my grand's dresses were inside. I'd seen photos of her when she was young and loved how she dressed. My mom mentioned that some of her clothes were still around somewhere, and I was hoping that I could try them on. The hinge thing that held it closed was a bit stiff, but I eventually worked it free. Inside was a folded piece of cloth along with a big stack of books and papers. The piece of cloth got my attention. I grabbed as many books as possible and set them next to me. That was when I saw a photo album with writing on the cover. I lifted it from the chest and held it in the dim rays of sunlight peeking through the curtains. On an old and yellowed strip of paper, taped to the cover, were the words, "Hex House." The words meant nothing to me but sounded interesting. To get a better look, I took it over to the sewing table. I pulled the lamp chain and the dim, dusty room flooded with light. I sat down in Grand's old chair and opened the album. The first page had a newspaper article taped to it. Before reading it, I flipped through the other pages. The whole book was nothing but clippings. I returned to the beginning and began reading. One by one, I was drawn deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. What I've written below is a brief account of a long-forgotten horror that took place in the waning years of World War II. It is, in just a few words, the creepiest true story I've ever heard. It was 1944. The place is Tulsa, Oklahoma. Allied forces were poised to launch their historic assault on Hitler's fortress in Europe, and the truth surrounding the duplex on 10 East 21st Street would soon be known worldwide. Carolyn Smith was a widow living in one half of the beautiful home on the corner of 21st Street in South Main. She had recently applied to the ration board for 7 ration books. Her request for such a large number prompted an investigation. Perhaps asking for one of them to be in the name of her English bulldog Bonbon tipped them off. Regardless, interviewing several neighbors gave police far more to be suspicious of. Reports of bizarre growls and screams were made. Even stranger, the 3 inhabitants of the home were seen burying something behind the house at midnight. These stories gave authorities enough cause for a search warrant. During the search, they excavated the backyard and found 2 coffins. Each held the remains of a dog. One happened to be Bonbon. Inside the home, a scene far more horrifying would be uncovered. Smith's 2 roommates were discovered in the cold basement, filthy, barefoot, and hungry. The women's sleeping area was found nearby. The beds were made from crates, and the women barely had any clothing to their names. What was found was dirty and threadbare. It was later confirmed by a repairman that at least one of the women had lived in this state for some time. Their living conditions were greatly different from their roommates. While the 2 women, Nell Willetta Horner, 30, and Virginia Evans, 31, stayed in the cold, dirty basement, Carolyn Smith lived in luxury upstairs. She not only owned enough makeup and perfume to stock a store, according to one report, She also owned 18 pairs of gloves, 26 hats, and over 200 pairs of shoes. These are only a few examples. Considering many of her belongings were rationed at the time, it's unclear how she accumulated so much. Despite their deplorable living conditions, Horner and Evans had jobs outside the home, yet they returned every day to their filthy basement dungeon. For 7 long years, the only other times they were allowed above stairs were to cook Carolyn's meals. On payday, they would turn over every cent they made to their cruel jailer, never once attempting an escape. When asked why, the 2 women claimed Smith had hypnotized and put a hex on them, in addition to other forms of magical control. By concocting her own form of Christian belief, she had managed to convince the women that she was the only thing protecting them from eternal damnation. The pair also believed that they would be rewarded in heaven for following Smith's every whim. The pair of women were not the only victims of Smith's nefarious acts. She convinced Virginia Evans' father that his daughter was gravely ill. He would send Smith over $17,000 throughout Virginia's time in the house, supposedly to pay for a nurse to help in her recovery. It's possible the list of victims is far longer. Both her husband and a maid had taken their lives under peculiar circumstances. In both instances, she benefited from large insurance policies she'd taken out on them. Scores more connected to Smith would meet convenient deaths, and many too had insurance policies purchased on them by her. Even after all the terrible things Carolyn Smith had done, she would only be tried on charges of coercing Virginia and Willetta to testify falsely about a neighbor. Further federal charges would be brought against her for the ration book fraud, but she would only serve a year in jail in connection to the coercion charges. After her release, the She Svengali, as she was known, would move from Oklahoma and disappear into history. The home at East 21st Street would become a morbid attraction around Tulsa until it was leveled in 1975 for a parking lot. Today, an apartment complex sits on the ground where the infamous house once stood. After I repacked the chest and made it back downstairs, I was so enthralled by the story, I had to do some research on the internet. No matter where I looked, any additional information said nothing about what happened to Virginia and Willetta afterwards. For all I knew, they could have been the little old ladies down the road. This was an especially annoying aspect, considering the media's more recent coverage focused on hauntings. They were so determined to make a spooky story around the Hex House, tales of possessed cars were being pushed. The lack of compassion shown to the 2 female victims angers me. If anyone reading this can tell me what became of them, I'd appreciate it. I hate not knowing. Hopefully, they were able to recover from the awful experience and live normal lives. As I wrap up my story, a few important questions must be asked. What did Carolyn Smith go on to do after she disappeared? But perhaps the most bothersome and personal to me, why did my gran have an album filled with clippings from the case? Is there something I should know? On June 12, 1977, approximately 130 young Girl Scouts from all over the Tulsa area gathered at the Girl Scouts headquarters in Tulsa. The group boarded buses destined for an annual week-long trip to Camp Scott. The camp is located near the Oklahoma town of Locust Grove, about 50 miles from Tulsa. The Girl Scouts had operated Camp Scott since 1928. The camp sat on 410 thick wooded acres. The Scouts were separated into small groups by age, then each assigned their own areas across the camp. Each of these areas were named after Native American tribes. Tent number 7 in the Kiowa camp was located at the end of the horseshoe figuration, furthest from the counselor's tent, but closest to the bathrooms. Because of the thick woods, seeing the tents next to you was very difficult. Staying in Tent 7 was 10-year-old Doris Denise Milner, a native of Tulsa. This visit would be her first to Camp Scott. Denise had shown a reluctance to going on the trip, so first-time counselor, 15-year-old Michelle Hoffman, took her under her wing doing all she could to ease Denise's fears. Upon reaching the camp around 4 p.m., Denise met her tent mates, Lori Farmer, age 8, and Michelle Goose, age 9. The girls seemed to hit it off right away. In total, there were 27 girls in the Kiowa area. After a talk about the rules and a sing-along that evening, the campers headed off to their tents. The counselor, Michelle, checked in on Denise before she turned in. All seemed well with the inhabitants of Tent 7. One final check was made by another counselor around 10:30. Throughout that night, a different counselor was awakened multiple times to deal with noisy girls in Tent 1 and 4. Said counselors passed Tents 6 and 7 and observed nothing unusual about either one. By 8 a.m. on Monday, June 13th, news would be breaking all over the Tulsa area of the murders of 3 Girl Scouts at Camp Scott. As the story unfolded, more details would be released. Apparently, 3 girls had been violated and beaten to death. Parents began flooding the Girl Scout headquarters, demanding to know what had happened. The entire nightmare had its source in what a counselor would discover around 6 a.m. She had been on her way to the bathhouse when she found a little girl lying on top of her sleeping bag near the base of a tent. Fearing there had been an accident, she assembled the other counselors to do a head count. After a search of Tent 7, a large amount of blood was discovered, but the girls assigned to it were gone, along with their sleeping bags. The main counselor drove to the camp director's office to get her and the camp nurse. When they returned, the trail to the bathhouse was walked again. 2 other girls were discovered in their sleeping bags. They, along with the girl from earlier, were all dead. All 3 victims were from Tent 7. They had been found just 150 feet from their tent. Lori and Michelle were the ones found lying side by side in their sleeping bags. Denise was found lying on top of hers. Her hands had been bound behind her back with duct tape. It was almost 7:30 before law enforcement arrived. The bodies were transferred to the county coroner. Autopsies determined Lori and Michelle had been beaten to death, while Denise, although she too had been beaten, died due to ligature strangulation. The time of death was between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. Reports still conflicted as to if the girls had actually been the victims of indecent assault or not. Denise and Michelle had cords tied around their bodies in what looked to be double half-hitched knots. The cords were wrapped around their bodies and tied to their wrists. At the time, crime scene investigators determined the attack originated inside the girls' tent. Their assailant, or assailants, were thought to have entered through the back, striking Lori and Michelle on their heads. On June 14th, the floor of Tent 7 was flown to the crime lab, and technicians discovered there was blood all over the floor that looked to have been wiped up using towels and mattress covers. 2 different prints were found in the blood and outside the tent, further strengthening the belief that there were multiple attackers involved. In addition to the shoe prints, a flashlight, duct tape, and a piece of cord were entered as possible evidence. While the investigators did their work, other law enforcement joined with volunteers and brought in tracking dogs from Pennsylvania. For 9 days the search continued, turning up next to nothing, and the investigation dragged on. On day 10, this would all change. Mayes County District Attorney Sid Wise held a press conference in which he named a suspect in the homicides, Gene Leroy Hart. A 33-year-old native of Locust Grove had escaped from the Mayes County Jail 4 years prior and was still on the loose. Hart had been convicted of kidnapping and assaulting 2 pregnant women and 4 counts of first-degree burglary. He still had 305 years left on his 309-year sentence. Evidence from the search seemed to show Hart had been staying in a cave just 3 miles from Camp Scott. Regardless of his violent history, Hart had many supporters. Many of them felt he was being targeted since he was a Native American and had embarrassed the sheriff by escaping his jail not once, but twice. Hart would eventually be apprehended 10 months later on April 6, 1978. Acting on a tip, officers found him hiding out in a shack owned by Sam Pigeon, a Native American medicine man. His trial would begin in March of 1979 in the Mayes County Courthouse in Pryor, Oklahoma. The Mayes County DA Sid Wise had withdrawn from the case after receiving some heat or shopping around for a book about the Girl Scout murders. The state's case was not a strong one. It relied only on hair and fluid samples found on the bodies. The state's theory was that Hart had entered the back of Tent 7, striking both Lori and Michelle about their heads, then bound and gagged Denise and took her from the tent to where he strangled her. Then he removed the other two victims from the tent to where they were ultimately found. Despite this theory, the state was forced to admit that they had no real proof connecting Hart to the scene. The defense, however, insisted that Jean Leroy Hart was a scapegoat, even insinuating the evidence found in the cave was planted. They had another man they claimed was the killer. William A. Stevens had been convicted of violently assaulting women and was serving time in a Kansas prison at the time of Hart's trial. Two witnesses testified at Hart's trial that Stevens had shown up at their door the day of the murders. He had scratches all over his arms and what looked like blood on his shoes. They also said the red flashlight found at the scene was Stevens'. Stevens denied their story, claiming he was at work in Seminole, Oklahoma at the time of the murders. His story was backed up by his employer's paycheck and time card. Hart's trial lasted only 10 days without him taking the stand. 6.5 hours after the case was handed to the jury, they had a verdict. Not guilty. One of the jurors would later state that within 5 minutes of entering the deliberation room, all 12 had voted not guilty. They felt there was just too many loose ends and that the prosecution hadn't proven its case. Denise, Michelle, and Lori's families were devastated by the verdict. Hart, however, would not be a free man as he still had to serve 300 years from his previous sentencing. 2 years after his acquittal, Hart was dead. He'd had a heart attack while lifting weights in the yard. His funeral would be held in Locust Grove with over 1,000 mourners in attendance. Still looking for someone in which to give the blame, in 1984 the Milner and Farmer families filed a civil suit against the Magic Empire Council of Girl Scouts organization. They claimed negligence because the camp lacked proper security, among other factors. At the trial, there was testimony from former campers and counselors as to some strange occurrences that happened prior to June 12, 1977. Prior to the murders, counselors were at Camp Scott for training. One of them reported her belongings had been gone through. Donuts she had in a box had been stolen out of her tent. The donut box contained a note that said, "We plan on killing 3 little girls." The counselor took the note to the camp director, who thought it was a prank. Another counselor in training reported hearing noises behind the staff housing unit. The camp dog, Sally, started barking and growling. Unfortunately for the families, the jury voted 9-3 in favor of the organization, and the verdict was upheld 2 years later by the state appeals court. In 1989, DNA testing was conducted on some of the evidence. Of the 5 aspects tested, 3 of them matched body fluids taken from Jean Leroy Hart. Only 1 in 7,700 Native Americans would match. These results deemed the matches inconclusive. In 2017, fundraising efforts were underway for more conclusive DNA testing. Over $30,000 had been raised so far. Carl Myers, a convicted murderer, is another suspect who had been looked at. A former prisoner came forward to say Carl had confessed. Myers died in 2013 of natural causes. He was in prison after being convicted of murdering Cindy Marzano of Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. The farmers organized the Oklahoma chapter of Parents of Murdered Children. Richard Goose focused on victims' rights advocacy in the 1980s. He helped to push the passing of the Crime Victim Witness Bill of Rights. He was later appointed to the Crime Victim Compensation Board by Oklahoma's then governor. The Girl Scout murders is still an open case. The first body would be discovered in the summer of 1999. Last seen in Lawton, the nude body of 28-year-old Jane Marie Chafton was found floating in Sandy Bear Creek. Her body had been in the water too long to yield any real evidence, but there was at least enough to determine it had been a homicide. Law enforcement had no solid suspect at the time. Chafton's profession resulted in a far larger suspect pool than usual. Like many of the escorts working the area along Cache Road, her drug habit put her in contact with a large number of unsavory characters. Just a few months later, in October, another female went missing. Her friends and loved ones hoped that 25-year-old Cassandra Lee Ramsey had gotten clean and off the streets. Sadly, 5 months later, their hopes would be dashed when Cassandra's body was found discovered under a bridge in Jefferson County. Her death, too, was ruled a homicide. To some in law enforcement, it was beginning to look like a serial killer was at work. In total, 5 escorts would be killed by the Lawton serial killer. The following are the names of his assumed victims: Jane Marie Chafton, 28, Cassandra Lee Ramsey, 25, Mandy Ann Raitt, 21, Janice Marie Buono, 29, Pamela Dawn Woodring, 34. In addition to these 5, some believe 17-year-old Tanya Marie Hook also fell prey to the murderer. She lived on Cash Road and disappeared in 2003. Her remains were found in a ditch 5 years later near the town of Cole. In each homicide, the women had been stripped and dumped in bodies of water. Almost all had drugs in their systems. Once a consensus was reached among investigators, it was determined that the same person or persons had committed their string of crimes between 1999 and 2003. All of the women were from Lawton. The most recent to move there was Pamela Woodring, who had just arrived after a stint in prison. The rest had lived in the city for some time. The few witnesses the police were able to find suffered from credibility issues as they were criminals and addicts themselves. After the final murder in 2003, the case went cold. As serial murderers are known to do, detectives feared their perpetrator had moved on to another city, and a whole new group of women were about to lose their lives. Serial killers can be a notoriously hard group to track. Many of them, including this one, often pick people who are in desperate situations like drug addiction and selling their bodies. These same communities are largely ignored by society. If they do die or come up missing, unfortunately few people care. Despite this, authorities did have a few theories. John Robert Williams is a long-haul trucker who was arrested in 2004 for the murder of 20-year-old escort Nikki Hill in Mississippi. His girlfriend, Rachel Cumberland, was charged as his accomplice. While in prison, Williams claimed to have killed upwards of 30 truck stop escorts over a span of 2 decades. Some of these poor women were from Oklahoma. In 2003, an escort out of Oklahoma City, Jennifer Hyman, was found dead under a bridge in the Tallahatchie River in Mississippi. Williams and Cumberland were charged in this case, but those charges were later dismissed due to lack of evidence. Despite the lack of evidence, Williams has been implicated in at least 9 other murders, including some from Oklahoma. Many of those Oklahomans were escorts, and their bodies were found in shockingly similar conditions as the victims in Lawton. Because of the proximity of victims to the highway, Williams became known as the I-40 killer. Some speculate that Williams may have started his spree in Lawton because of the similarities. The timelines also match up. Having stopped in Lawton in 2003, just around the time the Oklahoma City and other murders began. Although Williams was only charged in a small number of these murders and only convicted in the Nikki Hill case, there is no reason to believe he and his accomplice aren't involved in scores more. Sadly to say, there's just no evidence available to prove it. Even with all that, the Lawton crimes could possibly have no connection to Williams whatsoever. It's possible they were committed by someone else, perhaps a local even. Then again, the trucker angle may not be such a bad theory after all. The job offers plenty of opportunities to dump bodies en route. Not to mention, if most of the victims were escorts, many work truck stops on a regular basis, giving a killer ready access to his prey. Whether the killer proves to be a trucker or a deranged local, 6 women lost their lives to a bloodthirsty killer. For the sake of the families, the rule of law, and, of course, the women themselves, let's hope some new information comes forward. No matter their weaknesses, at the end of the day, these women were human beings. Nobody should be murdered and tossed away like a piece of garbage. They deserve just as much compassion as anybody else does, but even more, they deserve justice. Mildred Ann Newland Reynolds was still a relative newlywed on March 13, 1956. Her and Richard D. Reynolds, a schoolteacher and basketball coach, had just married the year before and purchased a farmhouse on a rural road near Avard, Oklahoma, 8 miles southwest of Alva. Mildred was a senior at Northwestern Oklahoma State University in Alva, Oklahoma, majoring in chemistry. At the time, the Reynolds were hosting Mildred Ann's nephew, Jerry Huckabee. He too was attending NWOSU. Ann and Jerry would ride back and forth to school together except for Tuesdays when he had a botany lab. March the 13th just happened to be a Tuesday. After eating lunch with Jerry until about 12:30 p.m., picking up dry cleaning and purchasing brake fluid, Ann started for home. When she was just 2 miles from Hopeton, Oklahoma, for some unexplainable reason, she veered into the wrong lane and stopped. According to Highway Patrolman G.R. Brown's report, her car tracks appeared to show that she put her car into reverse and began zigzagging backwards. After eventually stopping, she put the car in drive and raced across the road into a ditch, hitting a tree. It looked as if she repeated this maneuver, this time hitting a fence. Putting the car in reverse yet again, she started backing along the bank of the road in a straight line for 250 feet before finally stopping in the middle. This is the point where it was believed the car caught fire. From there, the car drifted forward 14 feet where it rested until found. A bit after 1 p.m., a local farmer, Leroy Lancaster, noticed some smoke but didn't investigate because several folks in the area had been burning thistles. At 1:45, Loren Goucher, another area farmer, was driving down the road with his family when he noticed the burning vehicle, a Chevy Tudor sedan. Goucher approached the car but realized the occupant was beyond help. He returned to his car and rushed into Hopeton to call Sheriff Ed Doctor. As authorities began working the scene, they quickly noticed how odd it was. First of all, Ann was found laying across the front seat, on her back with her head in the passenger seat, while her feet were positioned near the steering wheel. Stranger still, her arms were crossed over her chest like she had been placed there. One of Ann's shoes was found partially burned at the front of the left rear fender of the car and the other near the fence. The shoes were bloody, but since her blood had been completely consumed in the fire, it was impossible to make a comparison. Deputy Vernon Hackney located 4 scorched buttons 56 feet from the site where the fire initially began. Ann's coat was found, 90% burned, on the left side of the car. 2 metal bases from 12-gauge shotgun shells were found inside the car. However, it was difficult to say for sure if they had been fired or not. What the police had first thought was a solid lead quickly faded away when 3 9mm casings found near the tire tracks turned out to be unrelated to the case. After the collecting of the evidence was over, it came time to move the body. Ann had been burned so badly that she had been rendered unrecognizable. The case report indicated the left tibia was the only long bone still attached to her body, and one of her legs had burned off at the knee. Deputy Sheriff Doss Gurley took casts of the tire tracks, but the OSBI identified all of them to be from Ann's car. Investigators did not believe another car had crossed her tire tracks. However, Kenny Cole, former Alva Chief of Police, disagreed. According to the case notes, no footprints were found leading to the fields or to the side of the road. Since authorities never closed off the scene, it does seem strange that no other tracks or footprints were ever discovered. Cole still regrets not stepping in and suggesting that a cordon be set up. People were walking all over the roads, fields, and pastures, just trying to be helpful in finding evidence, Cole said. If there was any physical evidence out there, it got destroyed. The Newland family posted a reward for $250 for information about Ann's death. The sheriff received plenty of tips, but none proved to pan out. At a dead end, they looked to the medical examiner for clues. He noticed carbonized material in the air passages of the lungs, indicating she was alive for at least part of the fire. There were no signs of assault, but the body was so damaged it would have been hard to actually determine. The official cause of death was the fire, but why didn't she get out to avoid the flames? The only conclusion was that she had been incapacitated, but no one could say why. The coroner added that he saw no evidence of bullet wounds or fractures produced prior to the fire. Skull fractures were present, but he believed them to be a result of the intense heat. After the radiologist examined the x-rays of Ann's skull, he concluded one fracture at the back of the skull was caused ante-mortem. He said the fracture could have been accidental or foul play. Detectives then turned to the car to learn more about the nature of Ann's death. No major problems were discovered with the car. The fire was thought to have started at the back, near the left rear wheel. The cause was never ascertained, however. Because the windshield had melted, the fire was thought to have reached at least 1700 degrees. A fire of this magnitude would have required an accelerant. Investigators attempted to replicate the conditions. After setting a gasoline fire which only peaked at 1400 degrees, they tried a quart of brake fluid which Ann had bought prior to leaving town. Within 2 minutes, an explosion occurred and the temperature reached 1725 degrees Fahrenheit, leaving no doubt what made the heat so intense. It was still impossible to determine if the fire had been started with the fluid or caught fire after the inferno began. After the initial findings were in, a coroner's jury of 6 was assembled to judge whether Ann's death should be investigated further as a murder or if it was just a tragic accident. It was decided more investigation would be required to determine the cause, but they did lean heavily in favor of homicide. The investigators did just that and began to focus on suspects. Jerry and Dee, Ann's husband, both had solid alibis. Also questioned were 300 NWSU students who were not in class at the time of the fire. In interviews conducted, some of the questions suggested Ann had been meeting a beau the day she died. No one questioned ever suggested that was a possibility. In fact, many said the opposite. Of her past boyfriends, none ever alluded to her as being fast. Everyone who knew the couple said they appeared to be completely in love. Strangely, the OSBI later changed their classification of the case to an accident. They stated the reason for the actions of the car was that Ann had suffered a vertigo attack. Although she'd never been diagnosed with the condition, she had complained of similar symptoms to her doctor. He claimed he hadn't noticed any red flags while examining her in the past, but admitted he could have missed something. He said the roaring in her head could have been caused by an inner ear infection impairing her equilibrium. There is a problem with that assessment. Vertigo basically causes extreme dizziness, and it can feel like the earth is moving, but it doesn't affect mental faculties. Unfortunately, the case is still considered unsolved. Despite his alibi, whispers about Dee having some involvement in his wife's death persisted. He would eventually move away and start a family. No matter what everyone else thought, the Newland family never believed Dee could hurt Ann. They showed their support by maintaining a close relationship with him. Dee would even help Ann's father harvest his wheat every summer. Family members alive today do all they can to keep Ann's memory alive. A few have even pursued the case themselves, sadly with no further results. In a case so fraught with questions and dead ends, one more strange thing would occur on April 29, 1986. A Lawton, Oklahoma mother was found burned to death in a crashed car on a lonely stretch of back road. This death, too, was filled to the brim with weird occurrences and clues, perhaps even more than the Ann Reynolds case. More than a few people have noticed eerie similarities between both women's deaths. To date, both cases remain open and authorities see no hope in them being solved without the public's help. If you do have information regarding either case, please don't refrain from contacting law enforcement. I'm sure their loved ones would appreciate it. As firefighters rushed to the scene, none of them had a clue what they were soon to discover. It was just after 5:30 a.m. on December 30th, 1999, when a 911 call brought them to the scene of a house fire in rural Welsh, Oklahoma. Inside the now burned-out home, the charred remains of Kathy Freeman were found. She had been shot in the head. At first, law enforcement believed Kathy's husband, Danny Freeman, had killed his wife and fled with his daughter. Ashley and her friend Laura Bible after starting the fire, despite the Freeman car still sitting in the driveway with the keys inside. Things changed on December 31st when Bible's parents, Lorene and Jay, returned to the scene and found another set of remains in the rubble. The remains were ruled to be those of Danny. He too had been shot in the head. Authorities would search the scene a second time in hopes of finding the bodies of Ashley and Laura, but no one else was ever discovered. The night prior to the deadly fire, Ashley and Laura spent the evening together celebrating Freeman's 16th birthday. Not wanting to end the fun quite yet, Laura got permission to spend the night with Ashley. This would be the final time either girl would be heard from or seen again. At some point in the wee hours of December the 30th, a nightmare would come to life. No one will ever know for sure what happened that terrible night, but Lorene Bible never gave up hope that her daughter and Ashley would be found alive one day. Over 15 years passed, and authorities kept the case alive. Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted would feature the case on their shows in 2000 and 2001. HLN even included the story in a 4-part series titled Hell in the Heartland. It was released in July of 2020. The period between the night of the fire and now have not been without their moments of hope and disappointment. In the decade just after Ashley and Laura went missing, 2 convicted killers would confess to their murders. Tommy Lynn Sells and Jeremy Jones would both do so just to recant afterwards. Jones claimed he had killed the Freemans as a way to pay off a drug debt and then took the girls with him to Kansas. Supposedly, he shot them and threw their bodies into an abandoned mine. Subsequent searches of the mine yielded nothing, and Jones would ultimately admit that he made the story up to get better food and phone privileges. When the case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in 2001, rumors of local Craig County police involvement was mentioned. The Freemans had been feuding with the department over the shooting death of their son, Shane, after he stole a car. Despite ruling the death justifiable, the family threatened to file a wrongful death suit against them. Danny's brother, Dwayne, went as far as to claim Danny had told him that deputies had been intimidating him just before his and his wife's death. Then, in April of 2018, almost 20 years later, justice would finally be served. Ronnie Dean Busick, 66, was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. 2 other suspects who had since died were also identified: Warren Philip Welsh II and David Pennington. The Washington Post wrote that at least a dozen witnesses had heard the 3 men bragging about assaulting and killing the 2 girls, going so far as taking photos at the time. These witnesses also alleged they had killed the Freemans over drug money and held Ashley and Laura at Welsh's trailer for several days before ending their lives. One female witness who lived with Welsh provided a sworn affidavit that said the 3 accused disposed of the girl's body in a pit or mine shaft in Pitcher, Oklahoma. Law enforcement stated at the time they thought the remains had been buried in a cellar and then covered in concrete. After his arrest, Busick spoke with Laura Bible's mother, Lorene, and denied knowing the location of her daughter or Freeman. However, on July 15, 2020, he would plead guilty to the first-degree murder of both young women, Ashley's mother and father, Danny and Kathy Freeman, and to the burning of their home. He would also go on to admit withholding information about Welsh and Pennington's involvement in the crimes. His plea was part of a deal in which he would receive 15 years total, suspending the final 5. All of this was contingent upon his helping the authorities in attempts to find the girls' remains. If his assistance led to the recovery before his sentencing hearing, the term of sentence would be reduced to 5 years behind bars and 5 years suspended. He would, of course, also get credit for the time that he had already served. This deal was likely a hard thing to swallow for the victim's remaining family, but they were looking forward to finally getting their girls home. It seemed as though Busick was going to hold up his end. Acting on information from him, investigators searched and excavated a home in Pitcher, Oklahoma. Sadly, though, nothing was found. Because of this, the judge gave Busick the full term of 15 years, requiring a full 10 years be spent in prison. Even after all the dead ends through the years, Some in law enforcement are confident that it's only a matter of time before they'll find the victim's remains. Maybe prison will give Busick the opportunity to reflect on his despicable actions, and he'll finally give the cops what they need to find Ashley and Laura. I'm not going to hold my breath, though. Relying on a psychopathic mass murderer to have a change of heart is like expecting a lion to become a vegetarian. It's just not something they do. If you have any information, no matter how small, call your local law enforcement. Perhaps one of you out there right now has what we need to give everyone affected by this horrible crime the peace they deserve. Let's bring Ashley and Laura home today. It's now a common part of modern American lingo. Some light-hearted video game developers even created a very controversial game series based solely on this one short phrase, going postal. It's a term that we're all well aware of and may even use from time to time. But do you know where the phrase originated? If you were alive and paying attention in the 1980s and 90s, you may know it was a tempestuous time of economic and political struggle. It was also a period that gave birth to the mass shooting, at workplaces in particular. No other workplace seemed to play host to more of these than the post office. It was almost as if you couldn't turn on the news back then without seeing another report of a postal worker shooting up his job site. Just in the 90s alone, 6 different post office-related shootings occurred. 2 even happened on the same day. We now know just how bad things were to get after the turn of the century, but these events still shock the public greatly no matter how numerous they seem to be. These days, this stuff is almost commonplace. I'm not here to argue the finer points of what causes these events to happen. Rather, my purpose is to share the story of how a senseless act of bloodshed on August 20th, 1986, gave birth to a common phrase many of us often use in jest. After hearing this, you may rethink using it. The seeds of destruction were sown just the day before. Although there is no real consensus as to Patrick Sherrill's work performance, we do know his supervisors, Bill Bland and Richard Esser Jr., did reprimand him for something that day. Sherrill was a relief carrier, which meant that he lacked the job stability many of his coworkers with regular routes and more seniority enjoyed. This may have played on his mind and been a small part of what caused his break. Regardless of his supposed reasons, when he arrived at work the following day, he was determined to wreak vengeance on all those he felt had wronged him. In order to do this, Sherrill carried with him a Colt 1911, a Remington 1911, and a .22 caliber Ruger Mk2 pistol. Shortly after 7 a.m., he would claim his first victim, Supervisor Richard Esser Jr. Soon after killing Esser, Sherrill went into search of the other supervisor, Bill Bland. Fortunately for Bland, he had overslept and didn't arrive until the shooting had ended. Not finding Bland, he sought out co-worker Paul Michael Rockney and took his life. This was just the beginning, however. For the next several minutes, Bland would calmly walk through the crowded post office sorting room, shooting and reloading until he was left with one last bullet. Finding himself with no other options, Sherrill would turn the gun on himself. Out of the 100 or so employees present that day, 14 would die at the scene and another 6 required hospitalization. On May 29, 1989, a time when the shootings were still very fresh on America's mind, a monument to those who lost their lives was erected outside the post office south entrance. The memorial includes the bronze statues of a man and woman standing atop a pillar in the center of a fountain, holding a ribbon of which the bow is attached at its base. Although it may sound complex, it is actually very tasteful. The Edmond community joined with the USPS to build the monument. The bronze statues were created by sculptor Richard Muno. Each year, and in particular the 25th and 30th anniversary of the murders, people gathered from all around the world to honor the memories of those who lost their lives on that horrific morning. Below, I've included the list of those who were killed or injured that morning. I've chosen to include the injured because I feel that Even if they didn't sacrifice their lives, the scars they carry, mental and physical, are just as important. The dead. Patricia Ann Chambers, 41. Judy Stevens Denny, 41. Richard C. Esser Jr., 38. Patricia A. Gabbard, 47. Kenneth W. Morey, 49. Leroy Orrin Phillips, 42. Jerry Ralph Pyle, 51. Paul Michael Rockney, 33. Thomas Wade Shader Jr., 31. Patty Jean Husband, 48. Betty Ann Jarrett, 34. Patty Lou Welsh, 27. William F. Miller, 30. The injured. William Nemo, Jean Bray, Michael H. Bigler, Steve Vick, Judy Walker, Joyce Ingram. May they all rest in peace forever. Any avid reader of true crime will be familiar with this story. It was told in one of the top books of 2017 and has a movie based on it starring Robert De Niro and Leonardo DiCaprio in production. So if you've not read Killers of the Flower Moon yet, or want to wait for the film, I suggest you stop here. For those of you who stuck around, I'll begin. This tale takes place in Oklahoma during the 1920s. It's thought that somewhere between 60 to perhaps over 1,000 members of the Osage Nation and a few others died violent or suspicious deaths. The majority of these crimes occurred in or around Fairfax, Oklahoma. Few of these deaths were ever investigated, and those that were got little effort. The first noted here was that of 25-year-old Anna Brown. Her decomposing body was found in a remote ravine in Osage County. The case would quickly grow cold until Brown's cousin, Henry Rowan, was found shot in the head and partially frozen in his car in February of 1923. A month later, a bomb destroyed the home of Bill and Rita Smith in Fairfax. The explosion killed Rita and their servant girl, Nettie Brookshire, instantly. Bill Smith would pass a week later. At least 13 other full-blooded Osage men and women would perish between 1921 and 1923. Desperate for help, the tribal leaders of the Osage would request the assistance of the Bureau of Investigation in 1925. Sheriff James Monroe Pyle, a local lawman, had been working with the tribal leaders. He supplied the arriving agents with evidence leading to a deadly conspiracy. The early 1920s was the height of the Osage oil boom. In 1923, the tribe earned more than $30 million in revenue. Under the Osage Allotment Act of 1906, all subsurface minerals within the Osage Reservation were owned by the tribe and held in trust by the federal government. Osage mineral lease revenue was paid to the tribe as a whole, allowing each allottee an equal share of the money. These head rights were hereditary and passed on to the allottee's heir upon their death. However, one did not have to be Osage to inherit a head right. Here's where the story gets crazy. This is where William K. Hale enters. He encouraged his nephew Ernest Buckhart to marry a full-blooded Osage allottee, Molly Kyle. Molly's mother, Lizzie Q. Kyle, lived with the couple in Fairfax. Lizzie died in 1921 of what many suspected was poisoning. She possessed 3 full head rights, in addition to her own. She was also the mother of Anna Brown. Brown had been shot to death in the early hours of May 22, 1921. Then Lizzie's nephew, Henry Rowan, was found murdered in his car. For some reason, William Hale had been named beneficiary of Rowan's $25,000 life insurance policy. Finally, on March 10, 1923, Lizzie's daughter, Rita Smith, and her husband, William Smith, were blown up along with their servant in their home. With this string of misfortunes, Molly and Ernest would inherit a massive windfall. They too would have likely died had the Bureau of Investigation not been called in. Many others would lose their lives during this time, including a few well-known oil men. But for the sake of brevity, I'll focus mainly on the Burkhart, Kyle, and Hale connection. The borough had placed some undercover officers around the area upon their arrival. the agents would discover the existence of an evil group led by William Hale. Hale was an affluent rancher with his hand in numerous other pies, including banking. He referred to himself as the King of the Osage Hills. Fortunately for the Osage Nation, the king would eventually be dethroned. In January of 1926, now confident of their case, the Bureau began the arrests. Under interrogation, Ernest would tie a local farmer/ranch hand John Ramsey to the Rowan murder. After confessing his part in the Smith murders, Ramsey would in turn claim Hale was the mastermind behind the crimes. He also implicated two other men, Asa Kirby and Henry Grammer. By April of the same year, two additional men, Kelsey Morrison and Ernest's brother Byron, would be charged in the murder of Anna Brown. Between June 1926 and November 1929, the defendants were tried in federal and state courts. In June 1926, Byron Burkhart would plead guilty to the murder of William E. Smith and be sentenced to life at the state penitentiary at McAllister. He would turn state's witness and testify against Hale and Ramsey. These two men would be convicted for the murder of Henry Rowan and given life at the federal prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. A petty criminal, Kelsey Morrison would admit to killing Anna Brown at the behest of Hale. He would already be serving time when he was given a life term. Byron Burkhart would also turn state witness and avoid being tried for his part in the murders. Somehow, against the wishes of the Osage Nation, Hale, Ramsey, and Ernest would all eventually be paroled. Ernest would be given a full pardon by Oklahoma Governor Henry Bellman in 1965. In order to prevent anything like this occurring again, a federal law was passed in 1925 preventing non-Osages from inheriting head rights of tribal members with more than half Osage blood. What I've shared here barely scratches the surface. It's estimated that hundreds of Osage lost their lives between 1918 and 1931. The Hale Burkhart killings are just a sliver of the terror experienced by the Osage during this time. I highly recommend you do more research into these crimes. Photos from the new Scorsese film adaptation of Killers of the Flower Moon are beginning to trickle out, so it will probably be released in the next year. Regardless of how you learn more about the murders, you really should. Even I was unaware of them until recently, and it's a real shame, as the saying goes, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Let's make sure more people are made aware of this horrible story to prevent anything like it ever happening again. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in big compilations and save huge on data. Look at it anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.